Welcome to the second part of the history of the United States. And the judicial, Supreme Court and other federal courts, interprets the laws. Federalism. The Constitution establishes a federal system dividing power between the federal government and the states. Lists the enumerated powers, or listed powers that belong to the federal government and reserve the powers not listed to the states. Ratification. The Constitution was sent to the colonies for ratification. There were intense debates, and to ensure approval, the addition of a rights letter was promised. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. Letter of Rights, amendments, the promise of a rights letter, which guarantees individual freedoms, was fulfilled the approval of the first 10 amendments in 1791. These include freedom of expression, the right to carry weapons and protection against unjust searches and seizures. Amendment power. The Constitution includes an amendment process to adapt to changes in society. Later amendments, such as the 19th Amendment that guarantees the right to vote of women, reflect the evolution of American society. Implementation of the federal government. In 1789, the Constitution entered into force, and George Washington became the first president. The federal government settled in New York and, later, in Washington, D.C. Legacy and meaning. The Constitution of the United States is a fundamental document that has endured for more than 2 centuries. Its flexibility and ability to adapt to the changing needs of society have contributed to the stability and longevity of the U.S. political system. The Constitution and the federal government that established have been fundamental for the structure and stability of the United States throughout its history. Expansion to the West. The expansion to the West in the history of the United States was a crucial process that defined the nation and its geography. From the first settlements on the East Coast to the occupation of territories beyond the Mississippi River, the expansion to the West had a significant impact on the culture, politics, and economy of the United States. Here are some outstanding aspects of this phenomenon. Purchase of Louisiana, 1803. The purchase of Louisiana was an agreement between the United States and France in which the United States acquired the vast territory of Louisiana, which extended from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This agreement doubled the size of the nation and opened the door to a more significant west expansion. Route of Oregon and the gold fever of California. In the mid-19th century, thousands of settlers headed west in search of economic opportunities during the gold fever of California and the expansion of the Oregon route. These massive migrations contributed to the rapid development of Western territories. Destiny Manifesto. The idea of the Destiny Manifesto was a concept that argued that it was the destination and obligation of the United States to expand west and occupy the entire American continent. This belief influenced politics and territorial expansion decisions. Mexican-American War, 1846-1848. This war was fought for territorial disputes and resulted in the acquisition of vast territories including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The Transcontinental Railroad. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s further facilitated the expansion to the west by providing a rapid and efficient connection between the East Coast and the West Coast. Homestead Law, 1862. Homestead's law granted free land to those who were willing to establish themselves in them, as long as they would improve the land building homes and cultivating. This encouraged west migration, indigenous reserves, and displacement. The expansion to the west had significant consequences for the indigenous peoples that inhabited these lands. Many were displaced from their ancestral lands towards reserves, which led to conflicts and tragedies such as the Path of Tears. Border closure. At the end of the 19th century, The American border was considered closed, since most of the available territory was already occupied or assigned. This closure marked the end of an era of territorial expansion. The expansion to the west not only transformed the geography of the United States, but also had a deep impact on its demography, economy, and culture. This process influenced the formation of national identity and the creation of the nation that we know today. Civil War, 1861-1865. The American Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865, was a bloody conflict that divided the nation into two: the northern states, known as La Unión, and the southern states, known as the Confederation. Here, I present some key aspects of the Civil War causes of the Civil War. Slavery. The question of slavery was the fundamental cause of war. The tensions between the slave states of the South and the North, free states, increased over time. Economic and cultural divergences. There were also economic and cultural divergences, including differences in agriculture and industrialization. Secession and formation of the Confederation. Secession. After the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860, several Southern states separated from the Union, arguing that they had the right to do so, according to the theory of state sovereignty. Confederation. In 1861, these states joined to form the Confederation, choosing Jefferson Davis as its president. Attack on Fort Sumter, 1861. Start of hostilities. On April 12, 1861, hostilities began when the Confederate forces attacked the strong Sumter in South Carolina, which was occupied by forces of the Union. Official start of the Civil War. This event is considered the official beginning of the Civil War. Main theaters of war, this. Most of the battles in the East were fought in Virginia, including famous battles such as Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. West. The Western Theater included battles in Tennessee, Missouri, and Mississippi. Vicksburg's capture by La Unión in 1863 was a crucial event. Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. Abolition of slavery. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Proclamation of Emancipation, which declared slaves in rebel states as free. This transformed the moral and political nature of war. Gettysburg and Vicksburg, 1863. Battle of Gettysburg. In July 1863, the Union won a crucial victory in the Battle of Gettysburg, considered a turning point in the war. Vicksburg capture. At the same time, the Union captured Vicksburg, opening the Mississippi River and dividing the Confederation into two. Sherman and the March Towards the Sea, 1864. General Sherman, General of the Union. William T. Sherman led a brutal campaign known as the March Towards the Sea, destroying resources and causing the surrender of cities of the South. Appomattox Surrender, 1865. End of war. The war came to an end on April 9, 1865, when the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the General of the Union Ulysses S. Grant in Appomattox, Virginia. Reconstruction. After the surrender, the Reconstruction period began to reintegrate the Southern states in the Union and address the problems resulting from the war. The Civil War had a lasting impact on the United States. Beyond the enormous human and economic costs, the war redefined the nation and laid the basis for the abolition of slavery and continuous struggle for civil rights. Reconstruction. Reconstruction in the United States refers to the period that followed the Civil War, approximately from 1865 to 1877. It was an effort to restore and reintegrate the Southern states that had been separated during the war, as well as to address social issues, resulting political and economic. Here are some key points about Reconstruction, emancipation, and end of the Civil War, 1865, with the Proclamation of Emancipation, 1863, and the end of the Civil War in 1865. Slavery was abolished in the United States. The surrender of Robert E. Read in Appomattox in April 1865 marked the end of hostilities. Abraham Lincoln murder, 1865. Lincoln was killed in April 1865, just a few days after Lee's surrender, which had a significant impact on the Reconstruction process. Lincoln Reconstruction Plan. Lincoln's initial plan for Reconstruction was relatively moderate and sought quickly to return to the Southern states to the Union with few restrictions. Civil Rights and Amendment 13. Amendment 13 to the Constitution was ratified in 1865, abolishing slavery definitively. The 1866 civil rights laws were approved to guarantee legal rights and protections to black citizens. Reconstruction Laws, 1867. After Lincoln's murder, Congress led the Reconstruction process with the Reconstruction Laws, which divided the Southern states in military districts and demanded that they adopt new constitutions that guarantee civil rights. Amendments 14 and 15. Amendment 14, 1868, granted citizenship and egalitarian protection under the law to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. The Amendment 15, 1870, guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race or color. Provisional government and elections. During the Reconstruction, the Southern states were governed by provisional governments, in many cases led by whites from the North or by African American leaders. Elections were held and new governments were formed in the Southern states. Violence and discrimination. As the Reconstruction progressed, groups such as the Ku Klux Klan arose to resist changes and oppress the African American population. The laws of Jim Crow and segregation practices arose in the Southern states, institutionalizing racial discrimination. End of Reconstruction, 1877. The Reconstruction came to an end in 1877, when the Commitment of 1877, which led to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as president, resulted in the withdrawal of the South federal troops. This marked the beginning of the era of redemption, in which white control was restored in the South and segregationist laws were implemented. The Reconstruction left a complex legacy. Although progress was made in terms of civil rights and citizenship, the withdrawal of federal troops and the implementation of segregation laws marked the beginning of a period of systemic discrimination and struggle for civil rights that continued for decades. The Progressive Era. The Progressive Era in the United States covered approximately from the end of the 19th century to World War I, and was characterized by a series of social, political, and economic reforms aimed at addressing the problems associated with industrialization, urbanization, and inequality. Here I present some key aspects of the Progressive Era. Context of the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era arose in response to social challenges and inequalities generated by industrialization and urbanization in the change from the 19th to the 20th century. Factors such as political corruption, unhealthy working conditions, economic inequality, and lack of business regulation were important promoters. Political reforms, female suffrage. The fight for women's suffrage won impulse during the Progressive Era and culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave women the right to vote. Electoral reforms. Various reforms were implemented to combat political corruption, such as the introduction of primary elections and the direct choice of senators through the 17th Amendment. Social reforms. Temperance movement. The temperance movement sought to limit or prohibit alcohol consumption, culminating in the ratification of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. Educational reform. There were efforts to improve education, including the expansion of compulsory education and the improvement of conditions in schools. Labor reforms. Labor laws. Labor laws were implemented to address unhealthy and dangerous working conditions. Examples include the Workers' Compensation Law and regulations on working hours and salaries. Strikes and workers' movements. Workers and unions organized strikes and protests to demand better working conditions and fair wages. Economic regulation. Antitrust and antitrust. Antitrust and antitrust laws were approved to combat excessive economic power of large corporations. The government took measures to dismantle monopolies. Industry regulation. Government agencies were established, such as the Federal Commerce Commission, FTC, and Food and Medicines Administration, FDA, to regulate the industry and protect consumers. Conservation and environment. Conservationism. President Theodore Roosevelt was an outstanding defender of conservation, establishing national parks and taking measures to preserve natural resources. Food and Medication Purity Law. FDA was created to regulate and guarantee the purity of food and medicines. International commitment. Progressive foreign policy. In the international arena, progressive foreign policy focused on diplomacy and arbitration to resolve conflicts. President Woodrow Wilson promoted the League of Nations as a means to prevent future wars. Limitations and criticism. Although the progressive era made significant progress, it also had limitations. The reforms did not always approach the problems related to race and gender equally. There were criticisms of those who felt that the reforms were not going far enough in terms of equality and social justice. The progressive era left a lasting legacy in the history of the United States when the foundations for many of the policies and reforms that shaped the country in the 20th century would shape. World War I, 1914-1918. World War I, also known as La Gran Guerra, was a global conflict that took place between 1914 and 1918. It was an extremely destructive conflict that involved many nations around the world. Here are some key aspects of World War I causes of war. Imperialism, competition for colonies and resources. Nationalism, a strong sense of national patriotism and rivalries. Alliances system. Countries were grouped into alliances with the Central Powers, mainly Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, facing the Allied powers, mainly France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Murder of Francisco Fernando, 1914. The murder of Archduke Francisco Fernando de Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo in June 1914 was the trigger event that led to the declaration of war. Start of war, 1914. Fast militarization. Tensions led to a rapid military mobilization and the declaration of war between several nations in August 1914. Trincheras and War of Positions. The war stagnated on Western and Oriental fronts, and trenches systems were developed that characterized much of the conflict. Western Front. Notable battles. Battles such as Marne, Verdun, and Somme were decisive and bloody. Modern tactics. War saw the use of new technologies and